I'm Kurt Johnson with Rememberize. So I'm thankful y'all you came and joined us tonight for this webinar. We're going to do this weekly, and just to kind of make it clear what we're trying to do is our goal is to encourage everyone to write your personal story. And I like to call them the stories of your life instead of your life history, because we'd like you to write stories about the incidents and the things that have happened in your life instead of one big long life history that most of our children probably don't want to read. So so two things I wanted to kind of go into housekeeping wise. One is, once we make sure everyone can talk so I can hear you, if you have a question or something you want to jump in with while we're doing this, I'm hoping everyone can kind of mute themselves until you have something to say, and then unmute yourself to say it, or to either answer a question or ask one. So real quick, can we go around and make sure everyone I can hear everybody okay? Paula?
I had to unmute.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Donna?
Great.
Yes.
Okay. Sean?
Yes.
Okay. And Robin, you can hear me okay, and I can hear you?
I can hear you. Are you able to see me at all? I see it. There we go.
Oh, there you go. Now I see you. Now you're live.
Now you see that I need a shave.
No, you don't. You're fine. So the second thing, housekeeping wise, just want to let you know we are recording this so that we can put it up for a few people have signed up who can't come today, and we're going to be able to let them watch it to people who have registered. So just so you know that. I don't want to surprise you, but whoops, it's on tape. And a lot of it's going to be looking at some PowerPoint stuff and some other stuff. So before we start, any questions about what we're hoping to do? We're going to do these weekly about this time for a few weeks. One thing I'll tell you, and I'm going to do this at the end, I have a couple of sessions kind of planned out. This one for sure, and maybe next week. But what I'd really like to do is be able to answer your questions about the things you're facing as you write. So send me those questions by email or whatever, and I will kind of build these sessions around those questions to kind of help you do what you're doing better and have the answers that you need. So hopefully that works. So I'm going to begin. I'm going to share my screen with you and go to this PowerPoint, to a couple of these slides, and just talk about storytelling. We're going to talk about who Rememberize is and why we believe in the power of stories and stories of life. So we're going to talk about that. Any questions, unmute yourself and just yell out, because I'm going to try to have you on the screen, but I might not see you. So, and any answers to any questions I ask, I'd love to have this be interactive as much as possible. So, any questions before we start? All right, I'm going to share my screen here real quick and go to this here. So our topic that we're kind of going on today is what makes a good story. And so let me ask you that question, and anyone unmute yourself and answer this question. What, for you, when you're talking about the stories of your life, what do you think makes a good story?
I think usually funny experiences make a good story.
Okay, funny, that's good. Other thoughts?
Two thoughts. One is something unexpected, like a really interesting plot twist.
Ah.
And the other is a really good lesson.
Okay, excellent. Other thoughts?
Well, I was browsing around my computer the other day, and I found a letter I had written to my mother, wherein I had told an extensive story about the cancer my wife had.
Uh-huh.
So I grabbed that, and so health issues such as this that you make it through probably are a pretty good story as well.
Okay, excellent. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, we'll dive in and we'll talk about this as we go. All right. So, who's Rememberize? I'm going to give you just a real overview. For those of you who don't know, I hope everyone here knows what Rememberize does, but we create books in different formats. Photobiographies are kind of big, biographies, stories of life mini books, some children's books. We also are launching a new program to provide writing prompts and individualized coaching, which I'll show the website at the end, and you can kind of see how you can sign up for that and kind of interact with me and get some coaching. And then we also are delving into oral and video history. So that's kind of who Rememberize is. So talking about what makes a good story, I want to start with this. This is from the Bible. I apologize if anyone doesn't want to hear from the scriptures. I'm not going to read the scriptures, but I kind of get some of our fundamentals of why we do this from the scriptures. So this is a family tree, and if anyone recognizes it, that's the story of the genealogy of King David, which is important to us because it leads to Christ. And so I can pick up my scriptures and I can read who begat whom and who begat whom and who begat whom, and there's a lot of begats and begottens, and get a lot of names and a lot of history. But is that what my children want to read when they pick up my personal history? And that's where we get to what I like to do when I'm helping people put together a history, is make it so someone would want to read it. And so in the case of this story, someone would much rather read about the story of David and Goliath than read about who begat whom. So in the Bible, we also have the story of David and Goliath. So to me, the power of stories is, what do I learn from the story of David and Goliath? Or what happened with Bathsheba? Or the story of David and Jonathan and his friendship and relationship with Jonathan. And so I personalize that a little bit, and I take, this is my family tree. My photo's not even in there, so that's kind of embarrassing. But this is my family tree, right off of Family Search. I would be right there where that big blue thing is right there. And anyway, that's my family tree. And so that's an interesting thing, and that information's available on Family Search. But if someone wants to learn about me, they can learn a little bit from Family Search and from my family tree. But I think, maybe not, but my kids would be more interested in, well, this is also on Family Search. Some of my grandparents' information, and actually a eulogy from my grandmother, put photos of my parents and my grandparents, and some things. So that kind of information, we can put that together and give that to our kids, and that adds to the interest level. But in my life, my kids may want to know the story of the electric train. And I'm going to share just briefly these stories with you. I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, but when I was born, 2 months after I was born, my paternal grandfather passed away, and he was a railroad engineer. And on my birthday, he had dropped off at my house one of those electric train sets. And so it was at my house, and I played with it a little bit. And 2 months later, he passed away. So it was kind of a nice thing to have. Well, a few years later, my maternal grandfather came to my house and realized that needed to be more useful to me. So he built a little table in the garage that I could lower and raise back up to the ceiling in the garage and screw in some legs to, and actually have that train always set up in my house so I could enjoy the blessings of this gift from my paternal grandfather. And it's an interesting story, and I think something that my kids might enjoy reading about. Or I'm going to come back to this story, but in my family, if I put a headline, Sports, Jehovah's Witnesses, Hooters, and the Sabbath, what do they all have in common? There actually is a story that goes into those things all together. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Backyard baseball. I actually used to make up baseball games in my backyard and do the stats and everything, and I became a sports writer. So that's part of my background and who I am. And my wife, who's right here on the thing, we were high school sweethearts, and there's a lot of stories related to that and to the time we got together and how that happened and how the gospel came into play in that and how our lives changed as we met each other. And so going back, I'm going to tell a little bit of the story about the sports, Jehovah's Witness, Hooters, and the Sabbath. We had a time in our lives when we had become obsessed with soccer, youth soccer. I was coaching my sons and my daughter, but my oldest son was a really good soccer player, and he made it an elite soccer team in California after his junior year in high school. And we had gotten into a habit of doing a lot of Sabbath day soccer. After church, we'd go play soccer. In fact, right across the street from our house was from our church building was the soccer field where we'd play later that day. It was kind of embarrassing. But anyway, my son made this team, and when my wife, when he went to the meeting about the team, they learned about the fact that the fathers took the kids to Hooters every Saturday when they were at these tournaments, and that's where they'd eat. And the moms thought that was wonderful. And I also had an experience where I was coaching Little League Baseball where the Jehovah's Witnesses had told the region that they would not be playing in this baseball tournament on the Sabbath day. And I was kind of embarrassed because I wasn't the one telling them that with my religious beliefs. All those things came together to change what I did in my life as it related to the Sabbath day. And I believe that story is much more valuable to my posterity than my family tree and a few photos. And that's why I love the power of stories, because it's personal for me and it's personal for them. So I share that only in the way of kind of hoping to inspire us to find the stories. And now we're going to figure out how we do that. Oh, here's my question. And you don't need to answer. This could be rhetorical because you don't need to all answer this, but I want you to answer it for yourself and write it down and maybe think about it this week and maybe even share it with me by email or write something here. The picture is a picture of Enos from the Book of Mormon. If you're familiar, I don't know if everyone's remembered our church, but of the church that I am. But in the Book of Mormon, there's a man by the name of Enos who was chiseling his record on plates, and there was very little plate left for him to write on. And so Enos recorded a story, and it's the Book of Enos. It's very short. It's one chapter. It's basically one story from his life, and it makes me think about what would I share if I could only tell one story about my life? If all I could do was share one, what would it be? Let me give you just a minute to think about that. You may not come up with it right now. Of course, I asked myself that question. And then once I wrote that story, then the question after that would be, okay, if I could share one more story, what would that be? And I think that's a way to get started with storytelling, is if I could just share with my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren one story from my life, what would it be? And so if you take nothing else from this session, I encourage you to think about that and maybe write it. If you haven't written it already, write it. What's that one story you would tell and why? What do you want them to learn from that? So, what makes a good story? These are some of the ones I came up with. You guys had some great ones earlier. And I'm just going to leave these up here for a second. Builds faith. Entertains. The funny thing, that was good. Does it entertain? Does it make somebody laugh? Teaches a critical life lesson. Educates. Makes someone want to go and do something because they read it. Invites an emotional response. Creates a lasting memory or helps the reader to get to know me. So I'm going to turn off this PowerPoint for just a minute. If I can find my stop share, there we go. And come back to the group. Any thoughts on any of that? Any questions? Any thoughts on what story you would share or how you would come to that idea or why you would want to share it?
Well, it seems to me, as I ponder this, the story doesn't have to be huge, but I would think something that is life-changing, something that made a difference that changed your entire direction.
So, but you're saying that doesn't have to be huge. Help me with that. That feels like it would be huge, but when you say not huge, you have an example, maybe something that maybe isn't huge, but life-changing?
Well, I'll give you my example, although it embarrasses me a little bit.
I don't, if you're okay with that, that's good.
When I was a young man, I had a job in Boise, and I was making lots of good money, but I lived with a bunch of other guys. And in the home that we were renting, they had copies of Playboy laying around. And I looked at these books, and I could feel a pull and a draw. But then in our Eminent Gleaner group that we had, there were some beautiful young ladies. And I started thinking thoughts I didn't like. And so I decided at that point, I would never look at that kind of stuff again. And that made a difference in my life. It's headed me in an entire different direction. And that commitment has stayed with me. I mean, gee, 55 years almost.
So a small and simple thing that changed your life. Excellent. Other thoughts? I always like to hear people's stories, so I'm going to kind of leave that open for you to share.
No, I love your story, and one of the things that makes me think of is how your children may never known that about you. And as I've met and talked with my aunts and uncles about my father, he's not the person I thought he was. And so I like to hear the stories from my aunt and uncles about who my father is, and I don't want my children to have the wrong impression. They know me as their mother. I want them to know me as a faithful daughter of God. I want them to know me as a scientist, as a teacher, all these other aspects of my life, not just a mother, the mean mother that made them go to eat vegetables and all the things that I'm known for among my children. I'd like to be known among my children and grandchildren for other things as well. And so those are so I would like to tell stories about my life, as you did, Robin, that shows a different side of me. Donna, you had mentioned that what makes a good story is sometimes is funny. I'm kind of, you piqued my curiosity. Do you have a funny story to share?
I didn't have anything specifically, but I think one thing that a story that I've told my kids about, my grandkids about, they're just kind of getting into the ages now where they're wondering about what their parents were like when they were kids, or what I was like when I was a kid. And I don't think they knew until a little while ago that I could ride a unicycle, and how I went about learning how to do that, sitting on a unicycle between a door jamb, holding on to both sides and starting to pedal and falling off and bruising and banging up my shins and everything. And I do have a grandson now that can ride a unicycle. So I think that's kind of a neat tradition, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask you this question then, since we'll move from this for a minute. I was going to go do this with the PowerPoint. We don't need the PowerPoint slide to ask this question. What questions do you have about what you're doing right now with your personal history that maybe I can answer and address as we sit here talking? Anything you're working on and you're wondering, or that you started working on and you're wondering, how do I get to the next step, or what can I give you to offer you to maybe energize you to move to start or to continue or get going again? Any questions? And
I have a
inspire you to
question.
do so. Go ahead, Donna. Sorry.
I would like to write my mom's history. She's still alive. She's 97. Her memory's fading and she can't always come up with everything that is accurate. But I have so much stuff of hers, diaries and genealogy that she's done in pieces and books, and I mean, it's just a mess, and I don't know how to sort through it and pick out what I need to, I got pictures, and I would like to do like her story and my dad's story, her sister's story. She got a couple of sisters that were really interesting, that my kids knew, but my grandkids don't know. And I have an uncle that was killed in the Korean War in an airplane. So I have a little bit of his story to tell, and just, things like that. But I got so much stuff that just boggles my mind. I can't get it sorted and figured out.
I would suggest that you start with one. So pick one person and find what you've got about that person and put it together and start to read through that, and put the other ones out of your mind for a time while you kind of focus and see what you've got and read. You said you've got some diaries and some other things, and read what's there and start to organize your thoughts about that one person, and not worry about what you're not doing, but focus on what you can do and get that one person kind of set away and going, and then move to the next, or maybe delegate the next.
Do I just like take a picture and try to tell a story of that picture?
I would start with the text personally. I would start with, what do you have in writing that you can read? And then put to come and bring the photos into the text. But you can also go the other way. You could get the photos and find the text, but I think it's easier if you've read the stories, the journal entries, the diaries, and now you've got a familiarity with the story. You see a picture, sometimes it's going to come to your mind what that photo goes with, because you already read the story that affiliates with it, and it becomes easier to match it. So that's how I would start, just because that would be easier for me visually. But I would definitely focus on one person and not try to think about, I've got all these great people with all these great stories. I mean, my biggest problem is starting with me, right? I got to write my story, and I don't
want to start with her because she's not dead yet.
Yeah, and that may be the place to start is there while you can get the memories that you can get, and make sure that those aren't lost, and then move to the next person and the next person if you can find. So that would be my first advice. Just quick advice would be, start with one person, and probably start with most of the text stuff, the diaries and the journals and that information, and what you can find in terms of stories, and then bring back in the photos and audio or video that you have and match them back to the stories that you've read. And then you can kind of build from there.
So speaking of video though, would you recommend that there be some interviews in there as well?
I would. I mean, I think we would definitely, you know, one of the things my first webinar was actually just an interview I did with a woman who just finished her story from her parents, and she provided about 25, because they already had the audio and video, that are clips from she was doing her parents' story, not her own, and she included a bunch of clips from them, and she thought that was just powerful, that their voices were on tape, and that her kids could click on a QR code on a page in the book and listen to grandma and grandpa tell their story. And so if there's someone who's living who we're doing these stories about, we would definitely recommend that you shoot some video of them telling the story and include that with your written record as you put it together and make it available to people. Because hearing their voice and even seeing their face and hearing their voice is a powerful thing for people.
So you're talking about online books.
Our books are in print because that gives them a medium, so you can take your phone and you can scan it with a QR code and actually watch the video. If the video sits on YouTube, but the book itself doesn't sit on YouTube. The book is actually in our case, what we're producing is hard copy books, but they have those QR codes in them so someone can scan the code and watch the video or listen to the audio that's sitting on YouTube somewhere and hear their voice, and that's maintained. Or you could just keep those clips someplace where they're with your record, depending on how you're producing the stories, how you're distributing them, and just make that audio and video available to your family. There's a lot of ways to do that, and we can help you through that as you get to that point.
So how do you recommend organizing all that information? Is it you organize it? I mean, traditionally we do things chronology. You were born, you were raised, you went to school, but is there another way?
And there's all kinds. I mean, there's chronology is probably the easiest way, but sometimes it's a matter of organizing it by topic. Sometimes, honestly, you can start with chronology and then maybe organize the stories topically or some other way. But usually, if you can go to time periods of life, this is when I was my childhood. This is my family with my children. This is after my children were gone when I was empty nester. This is my career. This is my missionary service or whatever I did, and kind of organize that way to begin with. It helps you pull together the ideas. And then you can consolidate some of that information into stories that maybe tell the same kind of a message. And maybe in writing, you do it differently than chronological. But I would initially probably start chronologically if I'm just gathering from a bunch of information, only because you can create piles or bins and put the information in them and start by reading about their childhood, what you have, and what they had about when they were working in their career and with their family, with their kids, and then start to organize it in your mind and with notes. That would be my recommendation as a starting point, unless it's already somewhat organized in another way. Does that answer your question, Donna? What you're wondering about? I'm sure it doesn't fully answer your question, but does it get you started? I'll actually write that down. We'll talk about that in one of these sessions soon, because that's an interesting, the research is an interesting question.
Her journal entries aren't that interesting. It's like the weather and the bread, cost quarter and that kind of stuff. Some of them are, but the majority of them aren't that interesting. But I do have a lot of pictures and a lot of documents that I think I just need to get those sorted first by person and by family, and then I can move on to more specific things.
Yeah, if you can ID them, that you can go that way. One of the things about the entries that we think aren't very interesting, sometimes you can read the journal entry and most of it in there is the weather, and mine are like, who was giving me a hard time that day, and I want to rat them out in my journal because I don't want to tell them personally. But sometimes in there you get a little inkling of some interesting stories that maybe can lead you down a path to go talk to somebody about the story, and then you can build out the story and tell it, even though it's not written in their journal. So that's one of the values to reading the journal, is that you might get a little snippet of something that starts you down the path of a good story.
It's interesting when you say that about the weather, because I just read an article about how they determined when the first vision was by the weather.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else have any specific questions they want to run by me right now? Or
it seems to me that in the storyline that you might have, that there might be where you have a lot of information that doesn't carry the story, but it's interesting to have And so I'm wondering about the ability to have an appendix
Yes,
that says, if you want to know more about this, this is what I did.
I
For
absolutely would do
example,
that.
yeah, so if you do a thesis, you don't want to put your thesis in the middle of this, but you might have your thesis in an appendix.
Well, one of the things we like to do with the books we produce is we produce timelines of information. So there's just a breakdown of a timeline of someone's life that's in a graphical format, but they can see a timeline and take some of that information you're talking. If I'm doing a family history, you're going to take the family tree and you're going to put it in there, but you don't. What I think what would make the book even more valuable is when you add those stories somewhere that someone can just stop and read and then be driven to, like you're saying, to an appendix, to other information that fills in some of the details for someone who wants to look at that or take a quick look at a journal entry, a specific journal entry that might talk about the weather, or a family tree, or some photos, or some other information, documents even. In terms of personal family history, there may be documents that are in there, but they're not all of it. Some of it is also devoted to telling good stories that someone can sit down and read a story that's 4 or 5 pages long and be entertained or uplifted or strengthened because they learn a little bit about who I am when they read the story and not who they thought I was, as Paul was saying. For next week, we're kind of going to talk about coming up with those story ideas and how we do a little bit of that research and digging and coming up with story ideas. But again, as I said, I'm going to follow up by email with everyone who is registered and just say, if you have ideas and questions that you want us to address, we will address them. And we'll kind of create those as the topics of some of these webinars, and we'll customize them to your questions. So I'm happy to do that. In fact, I want to do that because I want this to be helpful to you. We'll go next week, same time, 6:30. And we'll put this recording online so you can go back and view your lovely faces and watch that PowerPoint again a little bit and think about maybe the questions. But I would encourage you between now and then to sit down and think about, if you were going to write one story from your life, what would it be and why? If all you could share was one, why would you write? What would you write about, and why would you write about it? And then write it. And share, what information, and then even share it with your family. Let me go real quick. I'm going to try sharing this again and see. It looked like I had a little unstable connection, so that may have been my problem. So I'm going to go somewhere else real quick. This is our website. If you haven't been there, rememberize.com, and I wanted to show you that and show you on this Preserve Your Memories link page, you can see we have some options here. If you wanted to check this out, we do offer some help beyond just coming to a webinar and sitting and listening to me talk. Some different types of promptings and coaching sessions that we can help do beyond you sending me an email and asking me a quick question that I'll answer, but where we can actually send you prompts and reminders to help encourage you along the process. So if you wanted to check this out and see if there's something there, that's at rememberize.com, and click on that link. You'll be able to see kind of how you can, we'll eventually have it so you can sign up and we can actually do an online virtual kind of a share thing and collaborate and kind of help you out if you want help, if you want to go that far. Otherwise, join us every week and we'll talk about this, and hopefully that gives you the encouragement to go back. And maybe I'll make an assignment every week like the one I made this week, that one story that you tell. Well, thank you very much for joining. We'll be back at 6:30 next week. I'll send you another meeting invite, and we'll talk to you then. Have a great rest of your week.